Bring to us your poetry from inspiration sought. Come join us with your images, your verses, words, and thought. From here, we'll share your balladry with those who do not know it. This platform's here for you to show the world that you're the poet.
Welcome to episode 3 of You're the Poet, the poetry podcast featuring you. I'm host Matt Bergio, and I'm here with co-host Phil Bergio. Phil, welcome.
Thank you.
First off, thank you to all of our listeners. We know that this is a work in progress, and we appreciate your support as we build the You're the Poet community. Here at You're the Poet, our purpose is to share our love of poetry with the world and invite you to do the same. If you've written any poetry and you want to share it here, whether you just have an interest in poetry, consider yourself an amateur poet, or are a professional poet with published works, contact us to be a guest on a future episode. Please check out the website at you'rethepoet.com. Follow us on Facebook for updates and info, and send us an email to host@you'rethepoet.com for feedback or questions about the podcast and how to be our next guest. Today, we're happy to feature our guest on You're the Poet, Mars Robinson. Mars, welcome.
Thank you. Hello.
All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started with one of our classics or poems that we like. And today I'll be reading William Wordsworth's I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud, or sometimes it's just called Daffodils. William Wordsworth was an English romantic poet. This poem is a lyric poem, which is just a formal type of poetry that expresses personal emotions or feelings. It's typically spoken in the first person. Wordsworth wrote this in 1804, and it was first published in 1807 in Poems in 2 volumes. Then that was revised in 1815. This poem was inspired by a walk that he had with his sister Dorothy, where they came upon a large stretch of daffodils, and you'll hear about those images in the poem. This poem is written in 4 stanzas, each of 6 lines of iambic tetrameter. Even though it's written in iambic tetrameter, there are a couple of variations that he uses as poetic devices to change that a little bit to give more meaning to certain words, and you'll hear some of that in the poem. And each of the stanzas has a rhyme scheme of A, B, A, B, C, C. And so that's just a little bit about the poem. Dad, is there anything that you have to say about this poem or that you'd like to say?
No,
All right. I've always
I'm not
liked...
familiar with it. You might have read it a while back, but I don't recall it.
Okay. I've always liked this poem because ever since I was a kid, here at Zor Acres, we always get daffodils in the spring just down the road, and it was kind of always a neat thing. So I discovered this poem and decided that I really enjoyed it, and I even memorized it at one point when I was memorizing poems regularly. And I actually had a cool experience similar to this poem when I was kayaking once, where I was kayaking on a lake, and I actually came upon a huge field of daffodils, very much reminiscent of this poem, and I thought that was cool. And as much as I like this poem, I've actually studied more of Wordsworth when studying sonnets. I used to study a lot of the ending of his sonnets to see what kind of rhyme scheme he would use or alternating rhymes in the sextet part of the sonnet.
Maybe I'll remember it once you read it.
So here's I wandered lonely as a cloud. I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high over vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils, beside the lake, beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze. Continuous as the stars that shine and twinkle on the Milky Way, they stretched in never-ending line along the margin of a bay. 10,000 saw I at a glance, tossing their heads in sprightly dance. The waves beside them danced, but they outdid the sparkling waves in glee. A poet could not but be gay in such a jocund company. I gazed and gazed, but little thought what wealth the show to me had brought. For oft when on my couch I lie, in vacant or in pensive mood, they flash upon that inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude, and then my heart with pleasure fills, and dances with the daffodils. William Wordsworth. So yeah, a lot of good imagery there, and just a poem I've always enjoyed.
It's a good poem. I think I remember it now. What I remember about daffodils is the farmhouse across the road that isn't there anymore. The daffodils are still there.
I spent the early part of my education reading Wordsworth or things like that as an introduction to poetry. And I was very late to actually picking up poetry and writing it and reading it. And I think that part of it was that I've always felt this like strange distance with poems in that format, poems about nature. My earliest days were in growing up in the hood. So I didn't have access to long walks in woods and things like that. But too divorced from how poems of the 18th century and 19th century kind of expressed the world that they lived in and how distant that felt from my world. When I hear it now, it's very interesting to me that those things felt so foreign, but now that I'm older, there's room to find that closeness. Now that I'm older, it's easier for me to appreciate that and appreciate what it is to stop and see daffodils and meditate on that. And that those daffodils don't have to necessarily be actual daffodils for me. That doesn't have to exactly be the lesson there. So I think with maturity, I've been able to find a closeness that I didn't always feel with works like that.
Nice. Well, thank you for sharing. All right, as we move on, I'm going to turn it over to Phil to share a poem with him. Phil, you're the poet.
Okay, hi guys. This is a poem I wrote a long time ago, probably 1980, when Matt was a little Weezer. He's the inspiration of this poem. It's called Little Ball of Mud and Fur. Look what I found. Look here, Dad. He's so small and looks so sad. I found him in the road today. I know it's not the place to play. He shows me what he holds, a ball of fur, of mud, of cold. He needs a home. He's got no dad. Not like me. That's why he's sad. The ball of fur, all ears and eyes, mews, small meows, and tiny cries. I would love to have a cat, it's true, but I know what I have to do. I'm going to give this gift to you. I thank him for his gift so rare and take the ball of mud and hair. This is no trick. He's so sincere to place the kitten in my care. Together we will share the chore of being dad for the ball of fur. Philip Bergio. It's based on he didn't find it in the road, but he found it in the yard. I don't even, was that Meowie?
Probably, yeah. I remember finding him out in the front yard, actually thinking he was a chicken and kind of as a kid running up to it trying to chase the chicken and actually ended up being a little kitten in the yard.
Oh, that's cute.
All right. Well, thank you for sharing that. Is there anything else you wanted to say about that? I know I feel like I always had a tendency to find animals. I think, well, actually, we're talking about that a little bit in my next poem, the poem that I'll be sharing. I feel like this place always seems to attract animals that are lost.
It's Zor Acres, and Zor is a biblical place of refuge. Matt's a cat whisperer. Here's a story. We were standing in a parking lot in Cleveland at an Italian restaurant. We had a family thing going. Everybody's standing around. You just don't say goodbye and get in your car in our family. So we're parking lot talking back and forth. Here comes this cat walking through a crowd of people, goes right up to Matthew. Hey, what can I say? He's the cat whisperer.
Always had that knack. All right, so on to our next segment. I'm going to share a poem called An Animal Sanctuary. This poem, two notes about it. One is that it's part of my Zor Acres collection. I have a series of poems that I wrote about Zor Acres, which is just our old farmstead here, where Zor Acres Studios is located. And second, this poem in my studies is actually, at least in its basic form, is inspired by the form of the poem I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud. So I kind of follow that 4 stanzas, 6 lines, and the same rhyme scheme as that poem. So thought it fitting to share this here today. So this is called An Animal Sanctuary. This land it holds magnetic force, a place of peace, tranquil and still, that sets all creatures to its course, who wander round the town until Zor Acres helps them find their way to where they'll come to live and stay. As random as the weather blows, stray pets abound upon the land, from where only sweet heaven knows. Their destiny our Lord has planned, these cats and dogs with hearts to heal, and even once a cockatiel. The wildlife, too, has called this home when seeking shelter, drink, or food. The birds fly in, the deer do roam, and many others have been viewed, enjoying what we have to give, so peacefully they all can live. So whether they be stray or wild, a cat or dog, or bird or deer, and whether strong or meek and mild, or whether brave or filled with fear, they'll have a place to call their own, where never-ending love is shown. Matthew Bergio. That just kind of sums up here the kind of like is the poem that my dad read, The Ball of Fur. We always had a number of cats, dogs, and yes, even once a cockatiel showed up out of nowhere.
We had a llama in the yard, miniature horses, full-size horses, goats, all somebody else's, but they all gravitated here.
Wow. I love that these 2 poems are just so great. They're like reflections of a person, just different. I don't know. I just think that's really cool.
Well, thank you. All right, with that, we'll move on to our next segment. That one features you, Mars. So you're the poet. Show us what you've got.
Okay. This poem is a prose poem. That's mostly what I write. It was published by Mary Baldwin on their online literary magazine, Outrageous Fortunes. You can actually Google it, pull it up if you want to. It is called Complaint V3. I've heard a lot of things about me. Some say I take up too much space, like a rash of carnivorous wildflowers, teeth-lined petals waving in the wind, biting at its meat. Some say my smile is aberrant, a plump glower wrinkled with ridges of flesh. No one ever told me I was empty, a hull of a broken ship. It wasn't until he filled me, rolled himself in wool that stuck to the boards of me, the wood of me, wool that dripped down his nose and out of his mouth, stuffing me. It was then I felt empty. His hands felt rough as they ran over the fibers of me, feeling my rigid breaks, and I would pray that he'd pull away with a piece of me under his skin. He carried a switchblade, and I exposed the underside of me, expecting his name to hurt. He left me full of the words he etched, and I cried against blue walls lending purple light because his name wasn't there at all. And I should not be surprised. Fragile is burnt onto me, foreshadowing the day that I'm driftwood, the day that I'm sand-bitten pieces. He pressed his fingers against the smoked brain and lamented. He thought I was something good before he knew of the fingers that set grime on my stern, the feet that had trounced on my sails. He made a place in me before he'd seen the termites in my gut. When he learned what wood would wind up where in me, he made sure I knew he could do better, that no amount of wool could fill my hole. And you can find me floating across a bathroom sink, the faucet still running, a tattered sail in the mirror. No one sets sail in a broken thing. Mars Robinson.
All right, thank you for sharing. Wow, a lot of strong poetic images there. I had a question. You said complaint V3. Is there a V1 and V2, or is it just the?
There is. Yes. I had the pleasure of having Aditi Machado as my professor at University of Cincinnati. She also has a book coming out soon. She's a brilliant poet. And she gave me this assignment to write from two alternating points of view, whether that be because of time or from two different subjects, whatever. So I wrote this poem that was version one. And there was a line in it, and she said, "You're using this word empty. Ah, it's so cliche. I hate it. Like, get rid of it." And there's this a lot of times in workshops and poetry classes. That's a cliche. It's just the worst thing in the world. And it's just the worst thing. You never want to have a cliche in your work. And I adamantly rebel against that. They're cliches for a reason. They touch us over and over again for a reason. They're used in different contexts for all throughout time for a reason. So I told her, I was like, I'm gonna make this cliche work. I'm not cutting empty. I'll change everything else about it before I cut empty. So it was a lineated poem. It was not a prose poem. And it became a prose poem in this third iteration. All of it was just to change its form and really work all around that nobody told me I was empty. That's the one thing that's still there from version one to now.
Oh, nice. I like that. And I agree. They're cliches for a reason. That's what people catch on to. People can relate to.
Mm-hmm.
That's why they're there.
And they're just words too. You're just using the words. I don't understand a cliche. What would be a cliche in a poem? It's coming from your heart and your soul. That's not a cliche. That's you.
Mm-hmm. I think the academic world can be a little too pretentious sometimes. I think it's a big part. That's a little. It depends on who you ask. If it's a little or a lot, I think most people would say a lot. But I think that is one thing that I think we are over
Like,
concerned about.
in,
Even
in,
as I said, I think one of the greatest poets out there, one of the most original poets out there working, that I had the pleasure of taking class with, and basically she is the reason that I write poetry. I didn't write poetry until I was 29.
have you
I'm
seen the movie
32.
Dead Poet Society with Robin
Hmm?
Williams? Have you seen Dead Poet Society
Oh yes,
when he
yes.
tears out of the book the description or of what a poetry is?
Hmm.
The definition of poetry. He says, rip that out of your book.
Yeah, it looks, and she definitely widened my view of poetry that way. But even then, the best instructor I've ever had, there's still that over concern in my opinion on cliche. It just is not. It's if you were afraid of being cliche, you never write a word. Honestly.
Truth.
All right. Well, thank you again for sharing. I might have to read that or listen to that a couple of times. I feel like there was a lot there, and I liked a lot of the descriptions that you used for certain things, like with the wood and the wool and even the termites.
Thank you.
A lot going on there. All right. Well, thank you for sharing. I think we'll wrap it up here. Before we go, I just wanted to, for our listeners, we did get a little bit of feedback from previous episodes. So I wanted to take a second and read a little bit of feedback. First one comes from Apple Podcast. This is from Cat Brew, titled Made Me Tear Up. I loved Phil's poem. I could picture Matt as a child sitting in the car looking at the colors of the trees. And that's in reference to his poem Perspectives that he read in our pilot episode, episode 1. Another feedback message we got was from Axel. Said that intro music has to go, LOL. It was pretty good. It would have been neat if you would have broken down Robert Frost's poem like an interpretive opinion. Axel, I have to agree with you a little bit. That intro music, it works, but it's intended to be temporary as we find something more permanent and more unique to the podcast. But I wanted to get the podcast out there, and I had to throw something up. Also, as far as in doing the interpretive opinion of the poems, we do want to talk about the poems a little bit. We're trying to do that a little bit more, but didn't want this podcast to be about overanalyzing things or getting too much into analyzation and interpretation. I kind of like to leave the interpretation up to the listeners.
Right. It's for enjoyment of poetry.
Right. We just like to share the poetry, get it out there, and then people can listen to it, enjoy it, and make their own interpretations. But thank you both for the feedback. Again, be on the lookout for our following episodes. Check us out on Facebook. Check us out at our website at you'rethepoet.com. And send us an email to host@you'rethepoet.com for any feedback, or if you'd like to be a guest on the episode. There should also soon be a section of the website that has information on what being a guest entails. But until next time, thank you, Phil.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Thank you, Marsh, for being our guest.
Thank you.
And we'll see you all later. Thank you. Bye.